Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I'm not used to hosting these, so please excuse my awkward introduction here. Let's call it that. I'm J.R. Bookwalter. I'm the mastermind behind Makeflix, and also happen to be the guy who edited all 4 volumes of Shock Cinema, and actually own the rights to the shows now, although I did not originally when they were put out. So tonight we're going to sort of go through a little bit of history, talk about some of the folks who were interviewed who are no longer with us, reminisce about just B-movies in general, how things have changed since 1990 when the first Shock Cinema was released, and hopefully have a good time, and you guys will be watching, and it'll be great. So joining me this evening for this festivities is none other than Miss Brinke Stevens, who was needs really no introduction, but she obviously hosted this and has hundreds of credits that I couldn't even. It would take me the entire hour to list the number of credits this woman has in the industry. So, Brinke, I am bringing you in, and here you are in there. There you go. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I'm in Ohio, and Brinke is in Los Angeles.
And we don't have to wear masks. I'm so glad.
Not for this, no. So what we're going to do is, this is all in celebration of this little piece of merchandise right here. This is the new Shock Cinema Blu-ray with a very cool slipcover, heavy-duty slipcover, signed by none other than Brinke on the back. There's only 500 of these in existence. A good chunk of them are gone already, so if you're waiting around, I don't know what you're waiting for because they won't be here forever. And but we're going to kind of rewind now. We know this is out. What we want to do is go back to the year 1990, 31 years ago, when this craziness all started. And 31 years ago, this is what Shock Cinema looked like. This is the very first VHS put out by Cinema Video, and it had 10 interviews, including yours truly. It was hosted by Brinke, and that was kind of how the whole thing started. So now I can't say that I was the genesis of this thing because I was barely around and I came in later to edit them, as well as sort of an afterthought of being interviewed. So Brinke, do you remember anything at all about the genesis of this? Because you're not just the hostess, you're also credited as a producer on this project.
Yeah, it says a Brinke Stevens production, and I really stand behind all 4 episodes, all 4 volumes. I appear on camera in volumes 1 and 2, and then I do a lot of narration in 3 and 4. And the way it came about was in the late 80s, like around 87, I had done a couple of movies with Dave Dakota, that were Nightmare Sisters and Sorority Babes in the Slime Ball Bolorama. And he had already given Linnea an opportunity to co-produce or produce some of his movies, like Creepazoids, Murder Weapon, The Girl I Want. And he came to me one day and said, I'd like to give you the same opportunity to be a co-producer in something I'm doing at Shock Cinema. And it would involve interviews with a lot of filmmakers at the time. Some of them were just starting out, but most of us had been in Hollywood for 10 years or so and had some experience under our belts. So much of the first volume to me is just advice that we're able to give to young filmmakers at that time. And I'm really pleased that Dave wanted to do that, to be so generous and to take the time to give tips and hints and valuable advice to anybody who's up and coming in the business at that time.
Well, let's talk, since you mentioned David Dakota, let's talk about him, because I owe a lot to Dave, because after making my first feature, I met Dave and basically wound up making my second, third, and beyond features for him, as well as years of doing all kinds of, he had me in, I'll call it white slavery, but it really wasn't. But he had me working at all kinds of stuff. I would do newsletters for him. I would do editing for him. I mean, basically anything he asked me to do, I would do within reason, of course. But and Dave's just one of those guys, very, very generous guy. I mean, he gave to me, and I tried to give to other filmmakers that came after me the same way. And why do you think that Dave was perhaps more generous than some other filmmakers who, were more closed or not open to those kind of things? I know one thing is Dave is an entrepreneur if he's nothing. He always loves a business opportunity. So anytime he can, like we did these crazy shot on video movies in the 90s, together, and you've done tons of stuff with him too. But what do you think is it that makes him such a generous producer?
Well, I wish Dave could have joined us today. I hate to put, words in his mouth, but I think that he was just very grateful to be embraced by the film industry. That he had, I believe the backstory was he worked at a theater in Oregon and always wanted to make movies, and came to Los Angeles and was given opportunities. And he was very young. He was in his early 20s, as many of us were, when we first got started. But he's just a really generous guy. And the mere fact that he would come to me and say, I want to include you as a producer in this, which I think really means, would you work for free? And you could
But that's okay. It's still a producer credit, and then later you can say, yes, I produced these, and, that leads to more stuff. It's still an opportunity, and that day was.
Yeah. And I'm thrilled that you've decided to re-release them. And in some ways, they're a little bit dated because, for example, in 1990, we're talking about film versus video and the relative merits of each. And of course, that's not even a discussion anymore. But the advice that's given in Volume 1 and in Volume 2, the makeup and actor reel, I think still holds true today. Yes. And there's a lot of really good information there. And then reels 3 and 4. 3 is just entertainment. It's kind of the clip reel, boobs, babes, and blood or something.
Yeah, and that was all stuff that Dave owned, and he was just like, let's put together a clip show. And I'm like, okay.
Right. And then Volume 4 is makeup effects. And I think that still holds true, because there's probably a lot of independent filmmakers across the country that wonder how something is done. And this spells it out in a very entertaining way.
Yeah, and I think even though CGI, computer effects have more or less taken over things, I mean, there's still a place for traditional makeup effects. I think that that's still, and practical effects, I guess is what everybody calls them. But the one thing that's interesting about that, especially the 4th volume with that makeup footage, I actually shot most of the footage that was, well, all of the behind the scenes footage from Murder Weapon, because I just happened to be there. I wasn't like anybody invited me or whatever. I was friends with David Barton, who did the makeup effects. He had done effects from my early movies, and a mutual friend, Dave Lang, was going on the Greyhound bus out to California to work on what was originally called Beverly Hills Corpse. It wound up being called Murder Weapon. So I just tagged along because I didn't have anything to do. My first feature was in the can and edited. All the picture work was done, but nothing was happening with it. So I thought, well, I'll just tag along. I brought my Video 8 camcorder, and David, I think, had asked me, like, hey, can you just shoot some of this stuff just for my own records? So I have it for posterity. That's where that behind the scenes footage came from. And when Dave and I started discussing that 3rd and 4th volume, I said, well, I have all this footage. We could do something with it. He's like, great, do it. That was the thing. Dave was always like, any kind of idea like that, he's all for it. So that's where that came from. But let's. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brinke.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying you were very lucky to have saved and had all that behind the scenes footage. And it must have been a tremendous editing job that you had to do. I mean, how much editing did you have to, how many hours did you have to put in on this?
You know, I didn't clock it, but it actually wound up being a lot more than I thought. And really, it was the third and fourth volumes. The original interviews, I would have loved to put outtakes from the interviews, but they don't exist. I don't know where those tapes went. But I did have the materials to sort of recreate the third and fourth volumes and bring them up to modern standards, you know, where all the movies look their best, and all the technology that I can throw at the video stuff to make it look better. And so I don't really remember how, I mean, it wound up being longer than I expected it to. And when I hit the fourth volume in particular, that one just, because it's more cuts and more stuff in it, took me a lot longer to restore. A lot of work goes into, you know, you have noisy audio tracks. These things were originally cut. The third and fourth volumes were cut on Super VHS video in my living room, literally. I mean, it was like tape to tape. So the technology was not high end, and you can obviously tell that looking back at them now. But I was able to go back and clean them up to where I think that they hold up, you know, under modern standards, anyways. So let's back up and let's talk about the first volume.
Okay.
The first volume of Shock Cinema, and that's this one in my hand here, which is basically 10 interviews. You have who's who of early 90s B-movie cinema, with one possible exception, and that would be me. But anyways, you have Charles Band, you have Fred Olen Ray, you have Jeff Burr, you have Scott Spiegel, you have David Dakota, C. Courtney Joyner, Ernie Farino, Dan Peterson, Chris Roth, and Mark McGee, and like I said, myself. So do you have any memories of interviewing those guys? Or I know you have had a long relationship with Fred, you know, and made many movies for him. So you probably have more stories to tell about him. But anybody else stand out in your memory at all about you?
Well, I rewatched all the volumes before this just to do my homework. And as I was watching volume one, it just struck me that I'm sitting in front of everybody and they're talking to me and I'm asking them the questions. And so it was really neat, even though I don't appear on camera and you don't hear my voice, I'm right there in the scene. And I love that it was face-to-face interviews with these people that I was conducting. I don't think I wrote all the questions. I wrote some of them, and Dave and I worked together on that. It was a collaborative process. And maybe we asked some of the same questions of everybody. But, you know, it's represented a lot of different, you know, we're talking writers, filmmakers, directors. Ernie Farino and Mark McGee, you know, had different careers. Gary Graver was camera. So the necessity was there to do slightly different interviews with everybody, but I thought it looked really good. The backgrounds looked different. We had one place where we did interviews, but we also went to other places like Fred Reyes and, you know, somewhere. And your interview, you were obviously somewhere else. You weren't.
I was at in Osama bin Laden's bunker somewhere. But that's what it looks like, anyways. I was in Ohio, and that was shot again on my Video 8 camera, so that's why it looks completely different than everybody else. But that was the thing where I had, by that point, I think I had made Robot Ninja and probably Skinned Alive for Dave, and he's like, well, we're making this Shock Cinema thing, so do an interview, you know, shoot an interview with yourself so you can cut it in. And that was basically how that all came about. You had an interesting story when we were talking before we went live about Jeff Burr making the comment about the budget. Why don't you tell me? Because it's an interesting contrast to look back 3 decades and see what they were talking about then and how it compares to now.
When I was watching volume one, and it was during the interview with Jeff Burr, and what really struck me is he's talking about like making his first movie, and his budget was $450,000, and he thinks that's low budget.
Yeah. Well, it was. At the time, it was. I mean, there obviously people like Fred and even Dave Dakota. I mean, they were making movies much less than that, even on 35 millimeter. But the average, what you would define as a low budget movie, was probably in the $500,000 range back then.
Hmm. Yeah, so that just, people would kill today to have a tenth of that budget for their movies. I also enjoyed in volume one how people were talking about making corporate films versus making indie films. And the
Yes.
corporate films, you get a lot more money thrown at you, the budgets are bigger, but you don't have the control and the freedom. And I really found that interesting that so many filmmakers had to weigh that choice and then choose to do a lower budget movie, but they had complete control over it.
Yeah, Jeff Burr is one that, because he was pretty much fresh off of the third Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, which he was literally hired on to replace somebody 2 weeks prior to. So that was a fresh wound for him at the time that you guys did that interview, because New Line, just did whatever they want with it. It wasn't his movie; it was a movie he made for a corporate entity. Still, I think the movie holds up very well. But he, every time you talk to him about it, he's like, blah, Leatherface, blah,
Yeah.
very hard on himself, as we all are, of course. So
Of all the people that were interviewed, Fred Olen Ray seems to have been the one that had the most experience in business. And
yeah,
he was an amazing businessman back in the day. It's just his personality. Um, he was incredible, and I really admired how he could get a movie in on time and under budget, and just being so clever and creative, and then having to deal with distributors and sometimes lawsuits and things like that. I wouldn't have wanted to walk in his shoes, but he was really good at it. And it wasn't easy back in those days when you wanted to be independent and you still had to deal with distributors and different things like that. Everybody had an uphill battle on that.
yeah, and a lot of people don't realize, Fred was doing all of those movies raising kids.
Oh, yes.
I can't even. I mean, now I have 2 kids, but I'm not making movies at the moment, so I can't relate to that, because I don't know how he was a single father.
Yes, single dad.
I mean,
Yeah.
I have such admiration for him for that. I mean, and he continues to be an entrepreneur. I mean, he has his own Blu-ray label. Of course, all that stuff is available through Makeflix as well. I mean, all these guys really. I mean, Charlie Band, of course, had tons of experience by that point. His father Albert, basically taught him the business by being on set, sort of by osmosis. But I mean, everybody had great. There wasn't really. I don't feel like there was anybody. It was like, oh no, that's not good advice. I mean, everybody had, maybe me, but everybody else had good advice to give, I think.
You did too.
Well, thank you. Well, let's hop on to volume 2, and I have a funny story. I don't know if you remember this.
You put stickers on with the volume.
It literally was me that printed these stickers. I didn't apply them, but the story behind that is Dave had ordered a bunch of VHS sleeves, at the time that he was doing the first volume. And I think there was a problem at the printer. They didn't, it was supposed to be whatever, let's say 1,000, and he wound up with maybe 10,000.
That's some mistake.
His solution, now this was all Dave's brainchild. His solution was just to put stickers on it. And it was literally like, we just stickered the list of people on the second one. It's the same box. I mean, like, you can't tell, and then just put volume 2 on it. So, you got to do what you got to do, right? It's low budget cinema. So for volume 2, we have Forrest J. Ackerman, who's not a filmmaker, but has been in many films and written about, I wouldn't even want to begin to count how many movies that guy's written about. Robert Quarry, Steve Neal, Deanna Lund, Ted Newsom, Melissa Moore, Joel Bender, Michael Burnett, Gary Graver, Frederick Bailey, and John Goodwin. So again, you've got a pretty long list of experienced people who were making the rounds in Hollywood at that point. And basically, we're doing the independent stuff. So there's 5 people that are no longer with us that were part of those first 2 volumes of Shock Cinema. So why don't we talk about those, and let's start with the big guy, Forrest Ackerman. I mean, this is a guy, I'm not sure that people could say now that they've influenced him, because Famous Monsters has been, so different for so long. It's not, Forrest magazine. It hasn't been for a long time. But for people like me, people like you, this was the Bible, growing up. That was where you found out about all your monster movies and all your, that was the thing. People like Joe Dante, John Landis, all those guys credit Forey and Famous Monsters, for getting into the business, or making them want to get into the business, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And you've had a lot of experience with Forey. I unfortunately, to my knowledge, never got to meet him. I wish I had, but just to shake his hand. But what was Forey like? How was your experience? You went to the Acker Mansion to do his interview for Volume 2. There's a whole little segment there in the middle of the show about that. But why don't you talk about Forey a little bit, and let's rekindle the interest in this man.
Okay. Forey Ackerman passed away probably 20 years ago. I think it was 2001, at the age of 95. So he grew up at the turn of the century, and he was going to fan conventions when he, in the 20s or 30s or 40s. So he was an early fan, and he did put together the Famous Monsters magazine, which was the Bible, as you said. And people who read it and loved it called themselves monster kids. Guillermo del Toro told a funny story at Forey's memorial, where he had been a little kid in Mexico City, and he would get copies of this magazine used whenever he could, and his parents didn't approve of it, and they'd take it away and beat him. And so he wrote a letter to Forey saying, "Please, can you adopt me?" And they intercepted the letter and beat him again.
Oh,
So, I know, but Forey was like the icon for that. And mostly he was a collector. He had an incredible home called the Acker Mansion in Los Feliz, and it was filled with hundreds of thousands of books and posters, and the walls were covered with original artwork, much of which had been the covers of science fiction novels. He had been a literary agent for a while for L. Ron Hubbard and I think Ray Bradbury at the very beginning. But mostly he was a collector and an incredible fan. And he had all these wonderful stories to tell, which was the same story in exactly the same way. People joked that there was a slot you could put a quarter in and ask, "Tell me about the story when you were 9 years old." And the magazine said, called him from the newsstand and said, "Pick me up, little boy."
It's in Shock Cinema Volume 2, the same story.
Yeah. So, and he always wore that same Hawaiian shirt, and that jacket and things like that. He was in a number of movies, mostly because people, like Joe Dante and Ted Newsom and people like that honored him by putting him in as an actor, as a cameo. And then I met Forey in 1974 at a San Diego Comic-Con. They had the first ever masquerade at Comic-Con. It had only been going on for 3 years. And I was a big fan of Vampirella, which Forey had created, the comic book. So I appeared as Vampirella. I had the little costume that I'd made out of a red leotard, and I had a cape on, and come out on stage and whip it off, the cape, and there I am. And the hooting and hollering that followed was just incredible. I couldn't believe it. And Forey happened to be one of the judges, but I ended up winning first place. And it led to a couple of things. One was the Comic-Con said, "Well, you won first place, so you're in charge of the masquerade from now on." I was 19 years old. I had no idea how to run a masquerade, but for the next 10 years, I ran the masquerade for Comic-Con. The other thing that happened was Forey said, "You should come up to LA. If you're ever up in LA, visit the Acker Mansion, and my wife, Wendy, and I will take you to lunch." So Forey became kind of like my godfather. My boyfriend at the time and I would go up to LA every chance we got. And Forey and Wendy would take us to a smorgasbord place that's no longer there, and we just hang out at the mansion. And it was just so much fun. He just had an incredible collection, and he adored the Robotrix from what was that?
Robbie the Robot, I think.
Well, Robbie too, but the Metropolis.
Metropolis, yes, of course, yeah.
He loved that Metropolis robot, and I just thought she was so beautiful too. So he had one of those. He had he had King Kong from the original King Kong. The armature, the fur was falling off it. It looked disgusting, but the armature was still there. And just all these amazing things. He had a War of the Worlds, war machine. And there was always something to see. And he was very open, where anyone could call his phone number, Moon Fan.
Yeah, that's right.
Put it out there, and you could come to the Acker Mansion in Horrorwood, California. And he had open house on Saturdays. So a lot of people got to go. And it was a dream come true for a lot of kids who had been reading the magazine. And it was a destination. If you came to LA, you had to go to the Acker Mansion.
The Acker Mansion and Universal Studios. Those were probably the big ones. Right?
Indeed. So he was, he was just, an icon. And I went to his memorial at the Egyptian Theater, and there were probably 600 people there. And a lot of people got up to speak about him, like John Landis, Joe Dante, Guillermo del Toro. And they all credited him with fanning the flames of their early fandom and really hooking them on that. And me too. I read that when I was a kid. I devoured Vampirella comic books, and Forey had a major impact on my life. He did something specifically wonderful for me, where he had a photo of me as Vampirella from the Comic-Con Masquerade on the wall of his office. And in '79, I think it was, a filmmaker named Dan Golden saw the photo of me as Vampirella and said, "Who is that girl? I want her in my movie." And it was only a short film. He was a student at USC. The movie was called Zizek is King. And that was actually the first time I was ever on film.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. My first movie was Slumber Party Massacre in 1981. Right. But that was the first time anybody put me in front of the camera. I played a witch, a barbarian witch in Zizek is King. So that came about because of Forey. So I really have him to thank for that.
Yes, you do. That's a great story. No, and that's funny because that's where that's with the acting bug bit you then, and you knew this is what I want to do, right? That was that moment.
Yeah. Well, and also the San Diego Comic-Con, when I continued to run the masquerade, I noticed that there would be a 10, 15-minute lull after the costumes while the judges were conferring to decide who was the winner. And we'd lose a lot of our audience. They'd walk out. They didn't really care who won. They just wanted to see. So at the time, I was teaching dance part-time. I'd been dancing since I was 4 years old. My mother enrolled me in tap, ballet, acrobatics, modern jazz. And I was teaching part-time at a dance studio in La Jolla, California. So I recruited some of my dancers, and we'd put on the halftime show. I did Killer Queen first, and then Funeral for a Friend, and Ballroom Blitz, and Sacrifice to Kong, which was done to a disco number, and just various things. The most people I had on stage was like 14 people, 14 dancers, plus a 3-piece live band for Ballroom Blitz.
Okay.
So that is really kind of what got me used to being on stage and being in front of thousands of people, because I never aspired to be an actor. I was studying marine biology at the time and figured I'd, work in a lab for the rest of my life. So I ended up in Hollywood, and I'm still here.
That's right. Still going. Well, how about, let's see, there's 4 others. Gary Graver, who is, of course, a cinematographer for, you name it, Orson Welles, Fred Olen Ray, many, 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 many. I mean, the guy's shot so much stuff. It's unbelievable. He's no longer with us. Deanna Lund from Land of the Giants was interviewed in Volume 2. She passed away just a few years ago, 2018, I think, at the age of 81. And then, of course, the last one is, I'm sorry, I'm skipping somebody. Robert Quarry, who played Count Yorga, also did cameos in many, many Fred Olen Ray movies, as well as other filmmakers. Very talented actor. And then the last one is Ted Newsom, who was a friend to both of us. I had worked with Ted at Full Moon a little bit. He had edited one of his later movies that he did was basically cut, and all that stuff all the post work was done at my place. And of course, Ted was a writing partner of yours. Do you want to talk a little bit about Ted? How you met him?
I met Ted in the early 1980s. And we met through mutual friends. It was at a screening at the New Art Theater, and I was introduced to him. And he said, I'm working on a movie called The Tag Movie Monster, which was later re-released as The Naked Monster. And I played Nikki, a scientist, an ichthyopaleontologist. And it's a monster movie. It's really goofy. It's kind of a clip job where he added some scenes from other movies. It was originally done in black and white, and it was just really hysterically funny. He had cameos from a lot of actors that have since passed away. Well, not you, but there were Robert Cornwaith and Ann Robinson, and many of the old timers were in his movie. So then we ended up becoming writing partners, and we sold maybe 6 scripts, all told. He helped me with Teenage Exorcist, but he didn't want screen credit on it because he was in the union and the movie was non-union. And also Fred wanted a rewrite on it, and Ted had had enough. He didn't want to work on the rewrite. So he kind of dropped out, and my name's on it. We had 2 scripts before he died. One was a big budget Sinbad movie, and we had brought in Ray Harryhausen as kind of a consultant, and also just to, honor him and have his name attached because it was reminiscent of a Harryhausen movie. So Ted passed away before we were able to sell it. But, he was just a good guy. A lot of people liked him. And it was sad he died during COVID. So we weren't able to have a funeral or a memorial. There was talk of having a Zoom memorial, but his surviving family didn't really know how to do that. So it just didn't work out that way. I also worked with Robert Quarry, who was just quite the character, very irascible. And he was in Teenage Exorcist. And I wrote the part deliberately for him. And he was in Haunting Fear. So I worked with him quite a lot and really enjoyed him. He was always very kind to me. And I also worked with Deanna Lund on Roots of Evil, where in our second volume, she kind of addresses this movie. And she's saying, like, well, there's certain things I won't do, but I did it with you. And what she's referring to is I never saw a full script on that. They kind of handed me pages every day, and I had no idea what the story was about. And then in like the final scene, she and I end up in bed together, kissing with a machine gun in between us. I mean, it turns out like we're lovers. And I'm a killer or something. I mean, I never quite figured it out. It's the most convoluted movie, Roots of Evil. I mean, it was fun to kiss Deanna Lund. She's a beautiful lady. But I think she kind of regretted having done the nudity and maybe the sexual connotation there. So I don't know, but she was just a lovely person.
Yeah, she talked about that a little bit in the second volume as well. Do you have any Gary Graver stories? Because do you remember how many movies he shot that you were in? There was got to be.
No, Fred loved to work with Gary. They were quite the team.
Yeah.
And Gary was just the sweetest person, and his girlfriend Jillian. She went to the same gym that I went to, so I'd often see her at the gym, and we'd stay in touch. But she died a year after Gary did. They were so much in love that he died of cancer, I think, and a year later she died of cancer. And she just was devastated when he passed, and she didn't want to be here without him. And all of a sudden she's gone too.
So they were together all those decades, huh?
Yes. She was this lovely blonde, long blonde hair, beautiful girl. She was in a couple of movies that I know of.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, I guess, I'll talk about my involvement in these first 2 volumes. Basically, I had made The Dead Next Door and had shot Robot Ninja Skinned Alive and Ghoul School in Ohio and New Jersey, and had taken that opportunity. After that, there wasn't much going on, so I packed my bags and headed to LA, like everyone does eventually. And David Dakota, speaking of generosity, was kind enough to say, well, if you're moving out here, why don't you come to work for me? I'll give you like 3 or 4 months of work, at the weekly salary at like this, and that'll just, you can kind of get your feet planted, So I was able to get an apartment and, all that stuff to get started, which not everybody has when they move out there. Usually it's quite the opposite kind of thing. But one of the jobs that he had for me was editing the first 2 volumes of Shock Cinema. I had a little Super VHS editing system, and the video, the interviews had been shot on 3/4 inch video, which is at the time considered, it was thicker, the tape, but it was considered a more high-end format. So we would cut it on Super VHS, and then we went to a place called Gosh Productions in Burbank, and basically reassembled it from the 3/4 inch tapes and added some fancy transitions and whatever we could. So that's how these first 2 volumes, I mean, they were you got to remember the time that they were made in, they're very like quaint is the word I would use. The production quality is quaint because it's, you have these transitions that you don't see in most movies. They're just, the way they were put together was well-meaning, but maybe not we didn't have the money to do it, full blast, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But we did it, and they were, the first 2 volumes sold very well for Dave. He was selling through comic book distributors and retailers wherever he could, just like the rest of his tapes. And then he decided, well, we should do more of these. I still have thousands of the VHS sleeves that we can put stickers on. So let's do 2 more. So then it became, and I remember this vividly because he was sitting in the couch in my living room in my apartment in Burbank, and he's like, well, what can we do? Let's brainstorm. Let's try and figure out what it would be. So we came up with, I think it was his title. He had the 3rd one. He wanted to be Bloopers, Babes, and Blood. He's like, look, I got all this footage from like Deadly Embrace, I think was kind of out of print at that point. He's like, I have trailers for that. I have footage from that. We have Murder Weapon. We have Robot Ninja. He's got bloopers from, I think, Dr. Alien and Nightmare Sisters. He had already had blooper reels. He's like, this will be great. We'll just put this together. Brinke will come in and do some narration, and we'll put it out. I'm like, okay, looks great. And then the 4th one, I think, was my idea. So that's when I said, I have all this footage. Why don't you do one like about the makeup effects? Because between Murder Weapon and Robot Ninja alone, there was enough footage to do a 1-hour thing. So this time they were just cut straight Super VHS tape to tape in my living room in my apartment. Very low end just to get it done and out. And then we brought you in, I think, in an afternoon and through these script pages in front of you, which Matt Walsh had scribbled up the narration, and he had also done the music score for them. And we recorded you, just reading the stuff, and then I went back and cut all that stuff in. And that was it. The rest is history. That's where volumes 3 and 4 come in. So again, you've got different color labels for these 2, but still labels. And they're filler. Essentially, it's funny. I was talking to Brinke earlier. I mean, it's funny because these 4 volumes would now be considered DVD extras or Blu-ray extras. They would just be stuff that you would buy the movie on disc and you would get this extra stuff. That's kind of but at the time, this wasn't so much of a novelty. There were other things like we talked about. Ted Newsom had made one called Monsters and Maniacs, which you also hosted. There was a lot of these kind of like, I guess they called them special interest videos back in the day, where it was, promoting old horror movies and just whatever. There was a lot of that kind of stuff going on. Shock Cinema wasn't alone in that. But do you remember anything about making the 3rd and 4th one? Or you probably were like in and out in an hour done?
No, really, I just came in and read the narration. I didn't see what was going on camera. But in volumes 1 and 2, I appear on camera.
Yes, you do.
And I'm so proud of that. I mean, I look back and go, oh my God, I was so young and pretty.
You're still young and pretty. Come on.
Oh, come on. And my figure. I wish I had that figure.
Yes, well, you opened the series by being in front of the Hollywood sign. So that's
yes.
Opening. And then do you remember there was a video store, because I know Dave took me to that video store. I don't remember the name of it. it's in the second volume. I should shoot myself for not remembering it, but it was on Hollywood, right? On
Yes.
Hollywood Boulevard, I think that video store was. And he had become friendly with Jerry, the guy that you're talking to. It was the owner, and he had, of course, an entire cinema home video section, as well as all the stuff from Charlie's Labels and Fred's movies and all that stuff. So he was a good customer.
I was the darling of video store owners, and one store in I think Los Feliz area had a whole shelf marked Brinke Stevens for just my movies.
They probably don't. I mean, nowadays you would have to have an entire wall with this many movies.
I know.
I'm up to
220 movies. I've done 6 so far this year, and I have 4 more to shoot the rest of the year.
That's fantastic. So everybody has new Brinke to look forward to probably next year. All these things.
The thing is now, I mean, when we started out, Shock Cinema obviously came out on VHS, and now it's comes out on DVD. There was that issue, and now it's on Blu-ray, and now streaming is the thing.
Yeah.
And many of the movies I do never have a DVD release. They go straight to streaming.
Right.
And I just love to have something to hold. I like to see the cover, and the Shock Cinema cover that was shot by Ken Marcus, who was a Playboy photographer at the time, and
well-renowned, what I recall too.
Yeah, he was one of their biggest photographers, and in 1980, I was married to Dave Stevens, the artist, and he shot 3 little Polaroids of me and sent them into We Magazine for their Girl Next Door contest, and I won. So Jeff Dunas, who was working at We Magazine, saw the Polaroids tacked up on one of his coworkers' billboard corkboards, and he said, "Who is that girl? I want to shoot with her." So I did a layout for We Magazine with Jeff Dunas, and then Playboy was looking for some people, and We sent me over to Playboy. And I met with Ken Marcus, who used me in some of his workshops that he was conducting.
Oh, wow.
So he became my main photographer. And toward the beginning, he would shoot me for free in exchange for things. So I asked him to do that Shock Cinema cover. And the dress I'm wearing, I had made out of an old kitchen curtain. Literally, I took the curtain.
That's the white one, the white sort of frilly one, a little bit.
Yeah. It was a kitchen curtain in my house, and I'm thinking, what can I wear? And I see that, and it's thin and see-through and frilly, and I'm like that. So I take the curtain down, and I fashion this outfit out of it, a 2-piece, and it looks great. It doesn't look like a curtain anymore.
No, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, so it's funny you mentioned that it's been released. It was, of course, you had the original 4 volumes, but Shock Cinema took some interesting detours over the years. The first DVD release was actually in 2004, where it was paired with another documentary that you hosted, Something to Scream About, which full disclosure, I produced and was directed by Jason Paul Collins. So you had 2 discs, one with the first 2 volumes only. And then you had Something to Scream About. And then it was also featured, this was a license deal that I had done, and I had kind of forgotten about till I was going through the discs on my shelf, but it was part of this Ghoul School 4-pack back in the day where Brentwood was putting these things out like crazy. It had Ghoul School, Filthy McNasty, Mulva, Zombie Ass Kicker, and Shock Cinema. So you had it with the first 2 volumes. You probably didn't even know that this existed.
No, I didn't.
So it's kind of funny, and that's actually Debbie Rashawn, who's a mutual friend of ours, that's on that cover of that one. And then, of course, in 2007, then I finally got around to putting the full 2-disc set, kind of reuniting all 4 volumes for the Shock Cinema collection. And that was pretty much, this is still in print. You can still get it, but I don't recommend it because this is much better and fully restored, and Brinke's signature, as I mentioned earlier. And you get a bonus soundtrack CD. Who would have ever thought in this day and age that you get a soundtrack CD with all 4 cues from Shock Cinema? There's some other music on there too. I padded it out, but it's a nice little package, and the reception to it has been fantastic. Everybody seems to dig it. I think, you know, we look back 31 years, and while maybe the volumes themselves haven't aged well, I think what's in them, the content, people look back on and remember fondly. I can't tell you how many people have said, even in this message thread, like, oh, I had those on VHS, or I had them on DVD or whatever. I remember those. Or so, I mean, it's funny to think, you know, that these titles have been around this long, and how much has changed, you know, for all of us. But you know, it's great to be able to go back and redo it without, you know, putting stickers on the side of the sleeve. Do it properly. Do it justice, right?
It was a clever solution. I mean, when you've got an overrun of covers, just
no, it was. I'm just ribbing Dave again. I begged him. I said, please don't do that. Please don't do that.
I think it was fine. You know, some people will go, that's a little bit cheesy, but if you understand that we had so many extra covers and had to do something with them, so it was the most cost-efficient way of doing it. I noticed that Jason Collins online, and he wanted to know about the artwork on this new cover.
Oh yeah, we should talk about that because it's a fabulous artwork. This is done by Alex Sarabia, and he did the pencils, and another guy named Carl Munster, who works for him, did the inks and the colors. And this, I commissioned this cover. I basically told him, you know, I want Brinke reacting, and, you know, sort of an assembly of the key players in the thing, and he went even above and beyond that. He's got this head is from, you know, pulled from Nightmare Sisters. You've got sort of a Linnea look-alike, you know, there in the corner, kind of cowering. So it's really, I mean, I think he did a fantastic job on the cover.
And Alex, thank you for making me so bosomy and boom. I appreciate it. Believe me.
It's a boo movie. You gotta do.
So I wanted to say that I saw you in person, and I signed those 500 covers.
Yes, you did. In my kitchen, right? Or to my dining room.
Yes, at your house. I happened to be back in Ohio in June, and I hadn't seen you in a long time, but we got in touch, and it was convenient to come over to your house and have breakfast with you and sign 500 covers.
You have to have supper through that bad hotel breakfast.
Yes, I appreciated that. Thank you. So that was fun to see you again and, you know, just catch up after all these years.
And that was the second release, because you also you did 1,000 Blu-ray wraps for Haunting Fear, which Retro Media. Fred
yes, we did. Yes, that was while Fred was still living in LA. He just dropped off this huge box of covers. But I found that I can sign pretty quickly. It just takes one day really to sign all of that.
Yeah, once you get going, it's not too bad.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you re-released Haunting Fear, because it only came out on VHS. It was never on, except bootleg copies on DVD. So thank you for doing that, because I love that movie.
I'll tell you, I do too. And that's the transfer on it is just gorgeous. That's a phenomenal disc. Fred really outdid himself on that one.
Yeah.
So if you haven't bought it, buy it. There's only 1,000 with Brinke signature, and they're almost done.
Yes.
What are you waiting for?
And there's only 500 of Shock Cinema, and you.
That's right. And those are getting up there. Those are going to be gone soon too. So you better get on it, people.
Yep.
Well, let's see if we have any questions / comments. This one I happen to agree with. It's just a comment. Brinke Stevens. I tend to agree.
Thank you, Derek.
Derek also said he loves Tempe movies. He rented Polymorph on VHS in 1996. Fan ever since. Thank you, Derek. Appreciate that. And let's see. Spaceman Stiff from Beyond Infinity says, OMG, we're about to see the Queen of Scream, Brinke Stevens. He loves her.
Thank you.
We all do. Come on.
I love you guys. Thank you for giving me such a long career.
Our mutual pal Joe Sherlock says hello to both of us. Jason Paul Collum, I'm not sure who he's referring to here. He says, you've lost weight. I think he's talking about me. Is that a fat joke that he just said? I don't know. But
I don't think it's me.
Oh, come on. This one's just
COVID weight.
We've got Wolf Toy 13, Brinke. I was just in the LA area. This is Jerry from Orlando.
Hey, Jerry.
Joe Sherlock also said, I had those tapes. What do you mean you had? Where are they? Joe, you got to keep that stuff. This is like printing money now. No, I don't know if that's true. But. Derek also said Brink was the best choice to participate in Shock Cinema. I agree.
Thank you.
Let's see. Chad Clinton Freeman says you both are legends, JR and Brink. So much love. Thank you. We appreciate it. Jason Collum, also, this is the celebrity in here. He says, technically, Brink was my launching pad when I moved to LA in 1998, but both you and Dakota were my film school and first opportunities at professional work. And as a matter of fact, I met Jason at one of your barbecues at your house in Van Nuys, and that is where our business relationship went from there. So that's how I wound up doing stuff with Jason.
Jason did a wonderful documentary called Screaming in High Heels. And you know, I love that. It's a wonderful thing.
I'll just throw that out there. If anybody doesn't have it, why don't you have it? It's not limited, but you know, $13.99. Come on, that's a
good price. Yeah, because it features interviews with me, Linnea, Michelle, Fredel and Ray, Dave Dakota.
Right. It's almost like a Shock Cinema, you know, redux. It's like a current, you know, but it goes deeper into that subject. So, okay, this is an actual question. Derek Rogers, which volume are your favorite, JR and Brink? Ladies first.
I obviously like 1 and 2 because I'm in them, and you know, visually. I found 1 to be really fascinating. Just the things people said about the movies they were working on at the time, and how they felt about things, and I was just fascinated. I watched the whole thing straight through. I love that.
It's interesting because while budgets may have changed, like going back to the Jeff Burr comment about the budget for his first movie, I think a lot of what hasn't changed so much is the studio politics and the studio interference. I mean, there's still, you know, I mean, now you could make a movie on an iPhone and just do whatever you want with it. Of course, we do have that option, which we maybe didn't then. But I think, you know, the film industry hasn't changed all that much.
The medium has changed, and you'll see in the first volume that people are discussing their relative merits of film versus video and how the difference and stuff. And so a lot of those filmmakers were working in film, and that's so much harder than video. You know, in certain ways, the big lights and having the short ends, you know, 10 minutes to shoot your thing. Video made everything so much easier, but you know, maybe the quality has declined somewhat because when you were shooting on film, you were so committed. You had to.
And you had to get it done quickly, but also with as least amount of film rolling through the camera, because that was your big expense. Single biggest expense was the amount of film.
Yeah, time was money with the film. Film was very expensive. So yeah, you had
I've often said the same thing about film editing. That, you know, now you can edit on the computer, you can do anything and press a few buttons and it looks great. But, you know, back then you actually had to think before you spliced it and taped it back together. Be like, oh, is this cut going to work out? And then if it didn't, then it's a big ordeal to sort of undo it. And, you know, that's probably the biggest difference. I probably have to go with, which volume is my favorite? You know, it's a tough call. It's got to be 1 or 2, just from the sheer amount of information. And when I was cutting them together, there was some conversation between Dave and I about who is going to be in which volumes. And we were trying to, you know, sort of spread it out so that we weren't having a lot of the same people talking about the same thing and that kind of stuff. So I think we did that okay, but I probably have to go with the original. And I'm not saying that because I'm in it, but you know, you can fast forward through those parts. But you know, it's funny to me because, you know, I got to know so many of the people that are in that volume. I guess maybe I'm closer to it than the second one, but that would be my answer, I guess.
Okay.
Jason Paul Collum reminds us that Shock Cinema was actually the launching pad for Something to Scream About because it was originally intended as volume 5, and that's true. I do remember that story. And here's a good question from Tim Rothfuss. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If you were going to make another volume, who would be on your wish list to interview?
That's a tough one.
That's a tough one.
Well, I'd want to do some of the actresses that are still in the business, like Debbie Rochon and Tiffany Shepis. I really enjoyed Melissa Moore's interview in the second volume, but after doing a few films and having moderate success, she gave up on Hollywood and moved back to Kentucky, where she raises champion horses.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's just it. Hollywood is not for everybody. I mean, I think a lot of people go out there with stars in their eyes and think, this is going to be the rest of my life. But if you don't do it with a certain mindset, it'll just consume you. So I can't fault her there. She wanted to get back to a normal life. Probably it's crazy out there, right? I mean, I lived out there several times too, so I know that exactly what she's going through. I'm not sure. Let's see if my wish list. It would be different probably now because, who are sort of like the B-movie kingpins now that I would want to, see interviews. I mean, we're so spoiled by, again, DVDs and Blu-rays that have hours of extra features. I don't know if you could do a Shock Cinema Volume 5 or, if you could reboot such a thing. I don't know what the reaction. I guess it depends on who you got in it. But
it'd almost be more like a documentary now.
Yeah, well, you could do a documentary about that era, certainly.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know that I have an answer for that question. There's probably, I mean, I'd go back to like the Joe Dantes and the John Landises of the world, who were the guys that I was idolizing coming up, that were started in B movies and made studio pictures, and are sort of maybe back to making smaller movies now, just because of the way the market is. But I can never get enough of hearing those guys talk. So
yeah, I just did a documentary interview along with Michelle Bauer about Dookie Flyswatter and Haunted Garage.
Star Nightmare Sisters, yes.
Yes, and he's in Shock Cinema. He plays Omar in Nightmare Sisters, and a lot of his music, Yumpin' You and Suckin' My Chimney and Succubus. So keep an eye out for this new documentary that'll be coming out maybe in about a year, because they're still
with us, or is it documentary?
He was interviewed for the documentary, but I don't think he's in good health.
Okay. Yeah, I think he was a little bit older when he did Nightmare Sisters, probably.
Right. Yeah.
Let's see. Let's wrap up with a few more. Alberto, this is one of our favorite Makeflix customers. He says, "I've got the Something to Scream About DVD with the 2 volumes of Shock Cinema. Most definitely looking forward to the blue. Makeflix is the indie Arrow." He means Arrow Video. Love it. Thank you, Alberto. Bobby Keller asks, I don't know even how to answer this. When are Zombie Cop 2 and Zombie Cop 3D and Zombie Cop 4 in space coming out? That would be never.
Can we talk about TE coming out?
Not yet.
Okay.
I don't think Fred wants. It's close. There's a TE coming out. That's all I'm going to say. But you can and figure out. Here's I guess one of our viewers is actually Alex, who did the new cover art. He says, "Hi, Brinke. It's an honor to draw you."
Well, I appreciate that, Alex. You did a terrific job. Thank you.
And Derek, who's full of questions tonight, asks Brinke, if done now, would J.R. Bookwalter be interviewed for Shock Cinema? No way! Yeah. That guy's here.
J.R. and I did a wonderful movie called Witch House 3 that he directed, and I was the witch, and it was a fabulous film. If you get a chance, watch that.
Shameless plug, and this is another one that's super limited at $10. There's I don't know, that's it. You're not going to see it again, probably. I think Charlie Full Moon has their own version of it. But
yeah, it's me, Debbie Rochon, Tina Krause. Great movie.
And that was a fun one to make, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, Ryan Cavaline, The Dead Next Door 2, he's asking. No. Jason Paul Collum asked, we covered this, but who did the art for the new release? That is Alex Sarabia, who was just on the horn there. John Wood says, I too love to have physical copies of movies. Now that group has gotten smaller over the years. You can't sell 10,000 copies of something anymore, but I'll tell you, the entire Makeflix business model is just around people who want to hold the physical stuff in their hands. And thank God for you guys, because you're keeping the stuff alive. I mean, it's, you know, you really are. Let's see. Here's a question, I guess technical question. Does a Blu-ray come with a Vimeo code? I love that add-on, and it does indeed. As you look on the back of the box, right there, there's inside. There's been a little bit of confusion about this, so I will just briefly cover this. If you look on the cover, the inside cover art, which is the original 1990 version, on the back, there's a link down here and a promo code to redeem that. So you have a streaming version as well. So it's not just the physical. When you're on the road and you want to watch it in your car, you know, you call it up, you can do that. So we've given you all the options here, all the options. Samuel Newmine says, Shock Cinema is on my list of movies that I have a lot of intentional and unintentional copies that I've bought as regular releases and was included as bonus features like Document of the Dead. Yes, I hoard this thing out as much as I could over the years. I did not originally own this. I guess I should explain this. Cinema Home Video, Dave Dakota, produced the 4 volumes, put them out on VHS, and then they were sort of lost to time. Over the years, I sort of went back and made deals with Dave to acquire all that stuff. Robot Ninja, Skinned Alive, Ghoul School, Shock Cinema, etc. So that's why Tempe wound up owning the stuff. And once I got my mitts on it, I was like licensing it to whoever would take it, because, you know, that's what you do, right? So that's why you have so many copies. Sorry. So Derek also asks, how long did it take to sign 500 copies?
Not that long, maybe 3 hours with
over the weekend, right? You had, I dropped them off on a Friday at your hotel, and you kind of signed them.
Yeah, and I brought them back to you, what, Sunday morning?
Yeah, when we had breakfast, yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
And then we kind of faked the picture, if you saw the picture on social media, that she was actually signing. So I have Haunted Fear on VHS, now on Blu-ray. Jason Paul Collins says you should seek out a lot of the titles featured in Shock Cinema because this will draw interest. I guess he's referring to everybody should go watch them. Jerry Brink, you coming back to Orlando for a con soon?
I'll be Tampa-based Screams in June of next year, along with Fredel and Ray. So y'all come down.
Dustin Hubbard says we need a new cinematic team up from you two.
Oh, that'd be nice. I
agree with him, but it's been, what was the last thing we did together? I know we did Witch House 3, and then we did, well, technically I was executive producer on Hell Asylum, which you were in.
Oh, yeah.
Something to Scream About, I guess, would be the last thing that we were sort of directly involved until this project. So
it's great to have a 40-year history with you.
Yeah, well, 31-year history. Yeah, we met. Actually, I don't know if I discussed that. We met on this project. I was editing the first 2 volumes of Shock Cinema, and in walks this vision of loveliness that I knew from so many movies, Brinke Stevens, and that's how that was how I met you at Dave Dakota's office on Selma Avenue, Cinema Home Video office, and I think you came in to do some screams for me for Ghoul School in post-production.
I screamed for a lot of other actresses.
I'm sure you probably can't even keep it straight at this point how many times you've screamed.
No, Jason Paul Cullen reminds us of Deadly Stingers, the Scorpion.
I'm sorry. Yeah, see, I forget that movie. So, yeah. But you did a fantastic job in that movie as well. You. Alberto also says, I met Brinke years ago at a con, and she's so outstanding. I agree. And she can do no wrong. I also agree. Big fan. And JR, we share the same birthday. Hey, August 16th, my man. Good job. So when Robot Ninja came out on Blue on the poster, it shows 8/16, and it's just like my favorite poster, man. Well, that's funny that, yeah, because he's referring to, there's like a fake comic book cover for the Blu-ray cover, and I think it was issue 8/16 or something like that, but that's why that is, because that was my birthday. So here's a little tidbit for you. Samil also asked, how was making movies when you started different than now? Is the ease of shooting offset by how much content is being produced now? It seems easy to get lost in the landslide of content. Well, that is very true. Brink, do you have anything to say on that subject? How,
Um,
then and now, as far as from the production standpoint?
Well, it's so much more streamlined now with video because you don't have the 5K lights and you don't have the heavy cameras on tripods. Everything can move so much faster because the equipment is smaller and lighter, and you don't need the packages like you used to need. So I think it can move a lot quicker than it used to. But I don't have the dressing trailer. I don't have, the lavish catering. I don't have a makeup artist sometimes. I have to wear my own wardrobe. So you don't get the perks like you used to have in the early days.
Big difference there, yeah. Well, let's do a couple more. Andrew Gilmore says, I'm a new fan. I only discovered Brink and the other Scream Queens about a year ago. Wow. Just want to thank you for so many entertaining movies, making quarantine much more fun.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. That's so kind. I'm glad. I appreciate that.
All right. Let me see if we have one last one. This one.
Here's one. Would you return to directing?
Yeah. He just posted a review of Chickboxer today, which I watched, and I agree with everything he said. So I don't know if he keeps posting those reviews, I'm going to have no directing career. No, I don't know. I mean, I jokingly say that when I'm restored all my old stuff, that then I'll have no choice but to go back and do it again. So we'll see. It's so different now. And everybody's pretty much, at least the low budget independent stuff. I mean, everybody's doing the same stuff that I was doing 30 years ago, making little movies for cheap. And it is easy to, as the other guy mentioned, to sort of get lost in a tidal wave of so many movies, and you're competing with Makeflix Netflix and HBO Max and all these streaming services that are making their own product. Where does that leave the little guys? I mean, it's other than Makeflix. That's where you go to buy this stuff, right? So that's a good closing thought. Any last final thoughts, Brink, on Shock Cinema? And you want to? No,
I appreciate. Thank you all for showing up for this. I really appreciate that, and all your nice comments. And those of you who have bought the movie and watched it, thank you. And if you haven't, why not?
Yeah, exactly. Because there's only 500 of them, right?
It's a lovely historical thing to have.
I agree. And thank you everyone for showing up. These things we put these things on for you guys. So if you don't show up, then we won't put them on. We'll just be Brink and I could just talk endlessly, together. So Spaceman Stiff. We'll do one more question here. Let's see. He says he calls it the Happy Meal box set. That was the SOV 6-pack that I put out last Black Friday. A bucket of flicks. He's saying I should upgrade from a Happy Meal to a bucket. Well, I'll keep that under advisement. Lee Claypool also says, can't wait to see you next month, Brink.
Okay, next month I'm in Ottumwa, Iowa, and then Scranton, Pennsylvania. Look for me.
Very good. And I will Makeflix will be at Cinema Wasteland in Strongsville, Ohio, first weekend in October. So if you don't want to wait to get your Blu-rays and DVDs by mail, you can show up there. I don't know if there'll be any Shock Cinemas left to sell by that point, but you better get it now. That's all I can tell you. And I guess we should probably also mention something to scream about, which is sort of related title to sister to, well, like I said, Jason said it was almost Shock Cinema Volume 5. And also available is Witch House 3. Haunting Fear is still available, signed by Brink. Only 1,000 of those available. And last but not least, of course, Shock Cinema. So if anybody still needs to get it, click that button that you see in the comments and go to town. Brink, thank you for joining me for this walk down memory lane. Hope it was a blast for you.
Oh, it was fun. And I really enjoyed watching all the 4 volumes again. I did it for homework, but I thought, wow, this is really good.
Well, thank you. I think we'll probably be doing something like this again soon, because there's another release with the initials TE coming soon that I can't talk about yet. But we'll be doing something else. And maybe Brink will be signing something that will be exclusive to Makeflix. to be decided. That's all I'm going to say. I can't say any more than that. So thank you. Good night to everyone. Brink, thank you again. If you stay on the horn here, I'll come in after the show. And thank you everybody for joining us. Hope you had a good time. I am out.